a chance to send us the link, I'll share out.
Yeah. I'm streaming on YouTube and I can get the link for that somewhere. I'm streaming on YouTube and
you get a little echo.
Who's got the echo? Oh, it is me actually. Right. Good evening, everyone. Sorry about the minor chaos. I thought we were at 500 limit on the Zoom and we weren't.
Can I admit the other 88 waiting at 97 in the waiting room?
Yes, please. There is an option to disable the waiting room if I can find it.
Well, I'll just put admit all and let's let them come in.
Right. There we go. And we need to find Jane in the list.
I've got, is that Jane is connecting to audio?
Right. Right, Jane's co-host now. We are back under control.
Just as well you upped it down. It's now on 280 and climbing.
Right, we are nearly 7 o'clock, aren't we?
Just about there.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for your patience tonight. I thought we had the Zoom account for 500 people and it was 100, so we had a little bit of minor chaos while we sorted that out. Thank you all very much. We've got 3 speakers for you tonight talking about swarms and different aspects of that. And I hope your bees haven't swarmed yet. I know there've been swarms down in London. But if we let Jane start tonight, Jane Medwell is a trustee.
Okay. No.
Are you ready to share, Jane?
I'm ready to share. Let me see. Microsoft PowerPoint. Here we are. Share. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jane Medwell, the BBKA trustees, and I'm going to take a very simple approach to swarming. I have to point out I haven't taken this photo this year yet, but it's another funny year, isn't it? We had a very cold spring last year, and it's becoming a feature of my life to come back from the spring convention prepared to do my first inspection rather than having for the spring convention as I used to do. And when I did my first inspections last weekend, I was quite surprised by how advanced the bees were. And I think I've got clear evidence that they're not only paying attention to the weather, but also to day length, because a lot of them were ready to swarm. In this talk, I want to talk about why bees swarm and why we want to stop them in a rather short form. I'm going to talk about the two key things you need to remember to be effective in your swarm control. I'm calling them key principles. And I'm going to romp through 3 easy swarm control methods and then talk a little bit about what you can do if you actually can't find your queen. And I hope that some of this is useful to some of you. Well, swarming. It's how our favourite superorganism reproduces. Bees are a superorganism. Individually, bees are not terribly bright. They're not great decision makers. But collectively, they're absolutely amazing. And like a superorganism, they show almost mammalian characteristics. And one of those is that they reproduce infrequently and at great cost to the colony. So when a colony is at its peak and swarms, that is the colony reproducing. It's a totally natural feature of their life cycle. And yet it costs them a great deal. They lose many of their bees, and the chances of survival of any swarm are quite low. Tom Seeley says less than 25% of swarms survive the following spring. As favourite superorganism produces through swarming, and bees are always going to swarm. Swarming starts well before launch date. They start preparing, the scout bees start checking out possible locations, and they do things like slim down their queen, they stop feeding her, and they start doing these ventrodorsal vibrations where they sort of bounce her. A prime swarm will take 50 to 70% of the bees in a colony. So it's a pretty dramatic event. And it isn't just one swarm in which they find their final location. As we know, they'll usually go to a location quite near the colony, but then later on they'll find a location further away. Bees don't want to swarm very close to home. And this picture, I don't know if you can see it or whether you're seeing my gallery. This picture is kindly given to me by my friend Barry Meachard, whose neighbour received a swarm handily on the shopping trolley he uses to put out his washing. This was one of the easiest swarms to collect. You simply lifted this shopping trolley up by the handle, banged it down over a polynuke, and the whole swarm dropped in. Hopefully, though, we're going to talk about how not to get to this state this evening. Okay, when do bees swarm? Well, I've put the lupins in because my mum always used to say the bees swarmed when the lupins flowered. All I can say is that global warming must have changed things because there are no lupins around now, and yet the bees are making swarm preparations. They swarm when the weather and day length are right for them. They swarm when the queen is getting old and producing less queen substance, something we've known about since Wylie in the 1950s. Queen mandibular pheromone holds the colony together. They swarm when the colony gets large, and so it has the potential to swarm. But being larger also makes it crowded, so that the queen mandibular pheromone may not be shared as well as it was before. In short, they swarm when the colony is decided, and that decision-making process is a miracle in itself. I really commend Thomas Seeley's work on this to you. And if you do a search on Google about swarm decision-making, you'll now find it's spawned a whole set of programs modeled on the way bees make decisions. But once a colony is decided and prepared to swarm, it will commit to it and go. I'm supposing, of course, that the queen can fly. Sometimes if you've clipped the queen, a swarm will issue, queen may return with it or may be lost, and the rest will just return to the hive. But they will go at some point. So clipping doesn't prevent swarming permanently, but it does make it slightly more convenient because you can usually collect them easily. This is a video of a swarm that I put up. Is it? Oh, don't you love video on Zoom? Right, forget it. Yeah, because when you're in a swarm, it sort of almost blocks out the light and is terribly dramatic. And that buzzing ought to be alarming, and yet isn't, because the bees are all narked up. They're all flying around in a benevolent crowd looking for where they're going. If you haven't stood out when the bees are swarming, I strongly advise it. It's fascinating. But perhaps we don't need to prevent it. Somebody said to me the other day, I let mine go because I'm in the countryside and they don't cause any problems. And I very politely and silently just gnashed my teeth at her, because I'm a beekeeper not that far from where she lives. And if her bees are in good nick, maybe it's fine. But if her bees are carrying any disease, it's very likely that swarming will bring them nearer to me. And therefore, swarmed colonies can present a disease risk to beekeepers. Incidentally, this picture is a bee tree I saw when walking in the Cotswolds. And if you peer at the dark brown bit, you can see that it's full of bees. I just walked beneath it and heard them buzzing, kind of unmistakable. Somebody told me, again, somebody who's very near to my apiary, I have bait hives, so I catch my own swarms. And I feel that if I'm catching swarms that aren't mine, mine are feeding somebody else's bait hives. I'm doing a reciprocal job. I don't think it works that way. I suspect that bait hives in your own apiary don't catch your own swarms, because swarming bees want to get out of the area that they were in, but it might draw other swarms into the apiary. And somebody told me the other day that they're repopulating feral honeybee colonies, which are an advantage to the species. Well, they might be, but more likely they're not. Few feral colonies survive. Many of them are constantly replaced by swarms coming
double sound.
from apiarists. Oh, I'm hearing other people here. Another reason to prevent swarms. Well, again, my mum used to say a swarm in May is worth a field of hay, a swarm in June's worth a silver spoon, and a swarm in July ain't worth a fly. We've heard that so many times, and this little graphic from Shirley and Richard Bond shows us why. You can see that the blue line at the top would be the full colony development of adult bees, but the pink line is what happens when they've swarmed. And the bit between them is the foragers lost from the parent colony, not just as foragers, but also the brood break it causes. So if your bees swarm in May, you may lose a lot of your crop through the summer. So we want to prevent swarming for our own selfish reasons. We'd quite like them to build up a large honey surplus for us to take. This is something somebody said to me, I just removed the queen cells. That prevents swarms. Well, it probably prevents them for a few days, but not longer than that. And you can probably get away with removing queen cells once, maybe even twice. But if they want to swarm, they will swarm. Removing the queen cells does not prevent swarming. I often get calls where people, particularly our beginners, say, my bees have swarmed. I don't think there's a queen cell or eggs in the old colony. And we know a simple answer for that, don't we? If you put in a frame of eggs and young larvae, if there are no eggs and young larvae in that colony and there's no queen there, then the bees will draw out queen cells. And if they don't, the queen's there and you just can't find her. And I hear this one all the time. My queen's disappeared and I've got sealed queen cells, but there are so many bees that they can't have swarmed. I'm just taking off these queen cells, which always makes my heart sink, because at her peak, the queen is producing 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. It's very hard to see from the quantity of bees whether a colony is swarmed. Now, if they have swarmed and you take away the queen cells, you might be taking away everything they can produce a really good queen from. So that one always makes me think, if you see queen cells, stop and think about your options before you proceed. Now, some people tell me they have swarmy bees, and I've been thinking a lot about this. What's a swarmy colony of bees? Well, all bees swarm. Any strain of bees that doesn't swarm will shortly become extinct. But bees that swarm might be bees that don't have enough space for either bees or honey. Maybe they need a bigger box. It might be where all the brood frames are full. If there's no egg laying space, then that probably signals to the colony, really, it's time to reproduce. We need to get this queen out and somewhere else. Or maybe the queen is a bit subpar. She's aging, she's producing less queen mandibular pheromone, and so it's not holding the colony together as well, and they're starting to think about replacing her. Some strains of bees are said to swarm more often. And if that's the case, well, then requeening is probably your best bet. It may be as simple as your colony is in peak condition, it's at its best, it's ready to reproduce. So the concept of swarmy bees is a difficult one. I wouldn't expect bees to swarm more than once a year. And if they did, I'd look at all these things to see whether we could give them a bit more space, whether they need requeening, and think about it. Why do we prevent swarming? Well, that ought to be how do we prevent swarming? This lovely little graphic from Adam Tofilsky is a slice through a developing queen cell. And I hope you all know these numbers, but if you don't, these are the numbers to know. It's 3 days an egg, isn't it? So on that 4th day, any female diploid egg can become a queen. It just needs to be fed royal jelly by the larvae and fed often. Queen cells are fed between 4 and 8 days. They're fed 1,500 times as opposed to 150 times for an ordinary worker cell. So feeding makes a huge difference. And day 4 is when you need that feeding to start for the best quality queen. Day 8 is when the bees seal that queen cell, day 8 to 9. So you've got that window between 4 and 8 where you've got open queen cells, you know they're going to swarm, but they haven't gone yet because they usually go on day 8 to 9 when the queen cell is sealed. Once you've got a sealed queen cell, then you've got until day 16 when she emerges, and she'll take a few days to mature and then mate, and then a few days to recuperate from a few mating flights, and she'll start laying. Remember the important numbers. Day 4 is becoming a larva day and getting fed queen royal jelly. Day 8 and 9 is sealing the queen cell, and day 16 is emerging, and about 21 additional days to get mated. So those are the numbers to remember, and if we know those, everything is possible. But that gap between 4 and 8 is our special gap, and we'll keep coming back to that. Now, we recognize queen cells. The ones on the left are quite clearly swarm cells, aren't they? And they're capped. They're beautiful, they're big, they're dimply, they have every expectation of a high quality queen. The ones in the middle, now some people would say, oh, well, they're clearly supersedure cells because they're on the face of the frame. I would be more circumspect. I think supersedure tends to be an autumn thing, and I wouldn't take any chances if I had cells like that in the colony. Well, they're sealed, so it's a bit late. And the ones on the right are what we call emergency queen cells. Can you see that they're stubbier and little? And they are formed from a worker cell where the bees have needed a queen desperately. And so they've pulled out the cell to the vertical, because having a vertical cell is what stimulates them to feed royal jelly and make a queen. And so the queens there might come from larvae that are a bit older than we'd like. They might not be quite as good. So you get to your colony this weekend and you've got queen cells. What do? Well, the first thing is don't panic.
I'll see you in the morning. Love ya.
Stop.
Night.
Think. Take a step back. Remember your numbers? That those queen cells will be capped at day 8 or 9. If they're capped, you might be a bit late. But consider your options before you act hastily. Ask yourself, do I want to start another colony, make increase? Because that's going to affect your choice of swarm control method. What kit have I got? That's going to affect your choice of swarm control method. You might actually just want to walk away in order to make yourself a box of frames. And what space do I have in my apiary? Have I got enough space to do a horizontal approach to swarm control? Or am I in a very tight space and I have to go up? All those help you make the decision about which approach to swarm control works for you on that particular day. Now, all of those approaches to swarm control, though, will use a couple of key principles, and I'm going to set those into a number of methods of swarm control. The first principle is about having 3 parts to a colony. We have the brood and nurse bees, which form one element of a colony of honeybees. We have the queen, a very important element of a colony of honeybees, and we have the flying foraging bees, which are a different element of the colony, and one that's been outside and is spatially geolocated to the location of the hive. Now, the first principle I'm going to introduce is remove one of those 3 components of the colony to prevent the colony swarming. Let's remove the queen. We're going to go through making up a nucleus colony. And that's usually the first technique we teach everybody because it's simple, it doesn't demand too much kit, and there are lots of things you can do with a nucleus colony. Now, making a nuke is really simple. First, you locate the queen, then you put a frame of brood with the queen on into a nuke box. And I've chosen a picture of a nice wooden one there, but let's be honest, most of us are using polys. You add a couple of frames of stores and lots of nurse bees. Shake extra nurse bees off other frames. Add some drawn comb or foundation, and I move the nuke away from the original colony with its entrance facing a different way from the original colony. And I put a little bit of loose grass in the entrance because that stops lots of bees flying out, but it wilts after a day and leaves them free space to go in and out. Let's go through that. Making a nuke for swarm control. You need a nucleus box with a feeder, some frames of drawn comb or foundation, and I always wish I had more drawn comb, but I usually have foundation, and some syrup to feed them. So, day 1, you go to your colony, and this is a nice colony. It's got a super on the top and a queen excluder, but it's full of queen cells, although the queen is still there. First of all, we're going to take the super and the roof and the queen excluder off to give us access to the brood box with its queen and its queen cells. And then I'm going to put a nice new nuke box. Why have I chosen light green? Well, that's like my polys. I'm going to move the queen on one frame of brood into that nuke box, but I'm going to check that frame of brood really carefully. I don't want any queen cells on there, because if I leave a queen cell, in my nuke, it will just swarm. Okay, so I check it really carefully. That's one frame of brood and the queen. And I can put more frames of brood or not, but as long as there's a frame of brood there and the queen, we're good. I usually add another frame of brood, a frame of stores, and nurse bees. I shake comb into there so that I've got at least an extra comb of nurse bees, sometimes two. And then I make up the space, ideally with drawn comb in the nuke, but foundation will do, and more drawn comb in the old colony. So at the moment, what I've got is the old colony, just exactly where it was when I first saw it this morning, but I've taken one frame of, a couple of frames of brood out with the queen and some stores, and I've put those into the nuke with a couple of frames of drawn comb. In the old colony, I've closed up the frames of brood, but all the queen cells are still there. Now, I'm going to feed my nuke because it's quite vulnerable and it needs to pull out, it might need to pull out some extra wax there. And I'm probably going to move that nuke so that it's facing a different direction from the old colony and put that bit of springy grass in the entrance. And then I'm going to turn my attention to the old colony. Did you see I've removed all the queen cells except for one, that pink one at the bottom? That's going to be my queen. Then I close it up and leave them to get on with it. Now I've put the super back on the old colony over a queen excluder. And in the old colony, I've got one queen cell, most of the old brood, and of course the flying bees are coming back to it, and those frames of foundation. In the nucleus colony, I've got a couple of frames of brood, a frame of stores, a couple of frames of foundational drawn comb, and they're being fed with syrup. So I've done that manipulation on the day that I found all those queen cells, and I'm going to leave them to get on with it. But here's our second key principle. We only want the colony to raise one queen cell to become a queen, but they're going to build emergency cells. So you need to remove emergency cells, and we need to think about our numbers as to when you should do this. Well, if the queen was laying eggs just before I removed her from the old colony into that nuke, those eggs will be hatching out 3 days from the manipulation day. And they'll be fed royal jelly on day 4, and they could turn into queen cells. So from day 4, there could be more queen cells. And at day 8, those would be sealed. So day 8 would be too late, and day 4 would be too early to remove those queen cells. So ideally, days 5 to 7, you should go back, check the old colony, and remove any emergency queen cells, leaving your chosen queen cell. And I'm choosing to do this 7 days later. So I'm checking the old colony, but I'm aware that the nuke's got a queen in, or I might have transferred some eggs in with the frame of brood that I transferred in. So I also check the nuke and remove all the queen cells 7 days later. And now I can feel quite secure because the old colony's got my one very pink queen cell to hatch out into a queen, and the new colony, my little nuke, has got the old queen. And after 3 weeks, I'd like to think, that's 3 weeks plus the 7 days, so 28 days, I'd like to think there would be a mated queen. But my experience tells me that many a beginner has been fooled by going back exactly 3 weeks later, not finding any eggs, buying an expensive new queen, and then going back again and finding that there's a perfectly good queen in there. Don't expect them to have read the books and get everything going within 21 days from removing the final set of queen cells. Give them a couple of extra weeks. So what you've done in this manipulation is on the day you found a colony full of queen cells, you've taken out the queen and a frame or two of brood and made up a nuke, and you've reduced the queen cells to 1. You've gone back 7 days later, removed excess queen cells, and now 28 days later, you've got a mated queen in your nuke and in your old colony. It's a good way of preventing swarming, but it does rely on those two things: taking the queen out from the other parts of the colony and controlling the queen cells. Now, a nucleus colony will probably need some feeding until it's got sufficient foragers and has drawn wax. And later, you're going to have to move a nucleus colony into a brood box if it gets bigger. But there are lots of uses for a nucleus colony. You could use it to unite a queen into a queenless colony, or give it away, or sell it. So that's one method of swarm control. Let's look at our principle number 1, the 3 parts of a colony, and look at another way of doing swarm control. Let's say removing the brood and nurse bees. So I'm going to do what's called an artificial swarm. I'm going to take the brood and nurse bees away from the flying bees and the queen. It's called a pagodon, and to do it, you need another complete hive, including frames of foundation, a feeder, and some syrup. And this is how we remove the brood. First of all, we go to our colony, and this is a good colony. It's got a queen excluder and 2 supers. The queen is in there, but also there are lots of queen cells. So, first of all, I'm going to take off these supers, and I'm going to move the old colony to a new site and put a whole new box of foundation on the old site. So the old site is where I'm going to make my artificial swarm. And I'm going to do that by moving the queen on a frame of foundation, which has got brood on, into the box of foundation. Basically, I've removed 2 or 3 frames from that box of foundation and moved the frame of brood and the queen in there. I think she's probably going to need some stores, so I'll move 2 frames of stores in there with her as well. And then I'll go through the old brood box, remove all the queen cells except for 1, and close those up. And then put in some foundation, both in the new artificial swarm on the old site and the old brood box on the new site. The artificial swarm on the old site has got the queen, and all the flying bees will come back there. The old brood box has just got 1 queen cell in. And I'm going to put the queen excluder back. And in this case, I'll put the supers onto the artificial swarm, which is mostly foundation, but a couple of frames of stores, a frame of brood, and a queen, and cover them up. And I'll also put the coverboard and roof onto the old brood, which has got 1 queen cell. Now, actually, I'm not sure it terribly matters. You could put the supers onto the old brood and feed the artificial swarm. Either way, the artificial swarm does need access to some food, either a flow or the supers or a contact feeder with a light syrup in, because they need to draw wax. Now, we've done our first principle of swarm control. We've removed the brood. But the next one, I'm not going to read those. The next one is still to come. There is a variation on this pagodon, which is called the Hedden variation. You can see we've still got our artificial swarm on the old site with the 2 supers on, and the queen is in there with all the flyers. And after 7 days, you can move the old brood box to the other side in the hope that bees will fly back to the original colony. I don't bother with that, to be perfectly honest, but lots of people swear by it. But there is something else I'm going to do after 5 to 7 days. I'm going to make sure the colony only has one queen cell to raise. Control those emergency cells. I'm going to go back into, actually, I go into both parts. The artificial swarm, it's quite possible that the colony, which was in swarming mode, will have made more queen cells on the frame that I put in there with the queen, if there were eggs or young larvae there. Or she might have laid more eggs and they might have made queen cells on those. So I always go back and check that part of the colony, but also the old brood. My chosen queen cell is in there, but also they will have made emergency cells. So I go back and remove them. Control your queen cells. Then after 7 days, what have you got? You've got your artificial swarm and you've got your queen cell in your old brood ready to hatch. And you leave them for 21 days. And hopefully when you come back, you've got a mated queen. So these are our 2 principles. If we only remember those from today, I think that's a win. Remove one of the 3 components of the colony and make sure the colony only has one queen cell to raise. Control those emergency cells. Now, we know that swarms can throw casts. Casts are what a prime swarm usually contains the mated queen, but sometimes virgin queens with smaller quantities of bees will follow, and we call those casts. In artificial swarms, more than one queen cell can cause casts. If you lose casts, you lose bees and weaken your colony, and you annoy your neighbours. So to prevent casts, limit the number of queen cells, and you might want to use the Hedden variation, although I don't use it myself. Now, you might be thinking, well, it's all very well, this moving the brood, a couple of meters away from the original site, but I don't have a lot of space. Or maybe I'm running out of kit. I haven't got enough roofs. Okay, you could do something called the Demaree method of swarm control. Now, the method of swarm control we just saw, the Pagden, produced essentially 2 colonies. The emphasis on the Demaree method I'm going to show you is on producing one very large colony. So it doesn't make increase like the Pagden, but it works vertically on the same idea of an artificial swarm. Basically, on day 1, when you find your queen cells, you might do a Demaree. Now I'm going to do it with these boxes without with the queen cells in. So on the first day, you rearrange the colony like this. I have put a box of foundation on the old site with 1 frame of brood, which, remember, I checked carefully to make sure there were no queen cells. And I also put the queen in that bottom box. So down below, we've got on the old site exactly an artificial swarm. All the flyers are coming back there. There's 1 frame of brood and the queen, and all the rest is foundation or drawn comb. Then I've got a queen excluder and 2 supers. Now, this colony had 2 supers when we started, but if it hadn't, I'd have put 2 supers of frames there anyway, because we're trying to create a space between the artificial swarm at the bottom and the old brood box, which I'm putting above another queen excluder on the top. That means that it's separated from the queen. So the flyers are still coming back to the old site, but the nurse bees are in the top with the queen cells and the frames of old brood. And you need to remove all the queen cells at the top. And you're left with this. Artificial swarm at the bottom, queen excluder, 2 supers, queen excluder, old brood with no queen cells. And I think you know what I'm going to say by now. What is it we do 7 days later? We come back and remove any emergency queen cells they've made. And we're back to the bottom box. They're pulling it out. They're making more brood down below this artificial swarm, and the queen's still there. But all the flying bees are coming back to this colony, and all the nurse bees are up top too. It's a very strong colony for honey making. And this keeps all the flyers together, but separates the queen and the brood by 2 supers. And you may need to put another super in the middle there. You can see that there are some advantages and disadvantages of this. It stops swarming, but it's a strong colony and it will likely try again later in the season. Also, if you're like me, it's really heavy getting those brood boxes up high. And if you have to put 3 or 4 supers between the bottom box and the top box, it can be difficult. Okay, the other thing you might say to me is, all these things are really okay in theory, but I can never find the queen. Now, let's be honest, in beekeeping, you don't often have to find the queen, but it really helps if you can for swarm control. And I expect one of the first things you've been told is, if you can't find the queen, shake off the stores and remove them and pair up the remaining frames, like in this picture. Leave them for 5 minutes for the light to get between them. And then what you do is you check, you pull out a pair of frames, open them up like a book, and the queen is most likely to be on the dark side. She's most likely to be between those pairs of frames, between the 2 frames in a pair. So you've got less surface area to check. But sometimes that doesn't work. If that doesn't work, we can do swarm control with or without queen cells by effectively sieving the bees. And I'm just going to show you how to do that. So, oh, I've got queen cells in this one. I was going to do it without queen cells, but never mind. You know your queen is in this box somewhere, right? It's got a queen excluder on and 2 supers. So it could be a box without queen cells like this. You know your queen's in there, but you can't for the life of you find her. First of all, you move the old brood off the original site just for a while and put a box of foundation on there. Now, as you can see, I've made a space. I've removed 2 frames of foundation. And what am I going to transfer in? Of course, I'm going to transfer in 1 frame of brood and the queen. Oh, I'm going to shake some nurse bees in and the queen. And what I will end up with is this. In the bottom, I've got 1 frame of brood and the queen. And of course, all the flyers are coming back to it. But most of that bottom box is foundation. Then there's a queen excluder. And above the queen excluder, I've got the old brood. And above that, there's a queen excluder and the supers. But what's going to happen is that the queen is going to stay with that frame of brood in the bottom and all the flyers, but the nurse bees are going to move up and they're going to coat and tend those frames of brood. So after 24 hours, you can remove that upper brood box with all the nurse bees and brood in, and you can treat it like, you know, half of a pagden, and you have got your queen in the bottom box with a frame of brood and 10 frames of foundation. Effectively, what you did was you sieved the queen by keeping her in the bottom box. All the bees were in the bottom box, and the nurse bees went up to above. Let me run that by you again. I added a frame of brood and shook all the bees into that bottom box. Every one. I even brushed out the bees from the old box before I reassembled it like this. So all the nurse bees then in the next 24 hours went up, and then I can take the brood and nurse bees away. Our basic principle of taking away one element of the colony. The queen, one frame of brood, all the flyers are left on the original site as an artificial swarm. Now I showed that sieving without queen cells in. If there are queen cells, don't shake the frame. Brush the bees off with a clump of grass or your hand or a bee brush. Don't shake queen cells. But that old brood could be left to make queen cells or could be split into nuclei. Now, if you do all this, people are going to say, I don't want any more colonies. I keep making increase. Every time I do a pacton or take out a nuke, I've got another colony. Well, yes, but you can always unite colonies. So uniting colonies is simply a matter of choosing which queen you want to keep, and you can assess the colony. Depends what's most important to you, maybe temperament or productivity. And maybe towards the end of the season, you can unite two colonies to keep the best queen going into winter really powerful. So you don't have to keep doubling your numbers of colonies. Some people say, I'm running out of kit. What shall I do? Well, some of these swarm control methods use more kit than others. And this weekend, when I had 8 colonies to split, I found that after I'd done a couple of pagdons, I was running out of roofs and frames of foundation. So I did a demery and extracted 2 nukes. It was very effective. A demery doesn't demand an extra roof, and a nuke doesn't demand a whole extra hive. And some people resolutely say to me, if I just give my bees a lot more space, like a double brood box, that'll stop them swarming, won't it? No, it won't. Swarming is how bees reproduce. And if they did that, if they stopped just because they've got space, they'd be extinct. So what are my top tips? Mark your queens. Oh, do it now. Although the colonies are getting bigger. Put out a bait hive. Always interesting to see what you get. Remember, you don't have to double your numbers every year, but if you unite in the autumn, it's a great way of replacing your queens. Sometimes you might have a holiday coming up in the beekeeping season. I'm afraid my husband's been known to book holidays during the beekeeping season. If in that case you don't have someone to go and do your swarm control, cheat. A Bailey comb change or a shook swarm slows a colony down and actually has benefits for disease prevention or varroa control. If your colonies swarm more than once a year, though, you either need to requeen with a less powerful queen or perhaps give them more space. If you split your colony without queen cells, they're going to need eggs. But always make sure you only have 1 queen cell growing 5 to 7 days after you split a colony. If you leave it 8 or 9, it will be too late. If you do it before 4, you won't see the emergency cells, not all of them. Don't just follow the rules, think like a bee. Remember those numbers, 4, 8, 16. Think, what does the colony want? Try to collect your swarms. Don't be a nuisance to your neighbours and try and be the beekeeper you wish had helped you at the beginning. When I was young, we considered it very unlucky to buy or sell bees, and it's still a great gift to a beginner to give them a swarm. And remember, every queen cell is potentially a new queen. All you need to know is that to manage swarm control, you need to remove one of the 3 components of the colony. Make sure the colony only has 1 queen cell to raise and control emergency cells. And remember your numbers, 4, 8, 16. And if you want more advice, David Evans' blog, the apiarist.org, is absolutely brilliant. Both the BBKA Guide to Beekeeping and the Haynes Manual are really good books. The BBKA Guide to Beekeeping is more comprehensive, and there's lots of good advice on bee base at the National Bee Unit. Thank you. I hope that's useful, and I wonder if we have any questions.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was excellent. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet.
How do I stop sharing? Stop sharing. Yeah.
There we go.
When you say you remove the queens, I mean, what do you do? Pull them out and squash them or something? Or sorry, it's a really naive question.
No, it's a really good question. It's the sort of things we assume. If I'm going in at the first time, I'm going to choose a queen cell that's not sticking out too much so it's going to get knocked off, that I can see a nice juicy grub in. It's always best to choose a queen cell where you can see the larva.
Right.
And you want to see that it's on some royal jelly, but you don't want it to get knocked off. So choose a good queen cell, and the others you can literally squish off with your fingers. If you don't want them, you just destroy them.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dan Forster's got his hand up.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Lovely. So thank you very much for the presentation. Really, really interesting. I'm in my second season, so I'm still new. I've got swarm cells. I've just done a split into a nuke using the method that you described, the first one. There's nothing moving in or out of my nucleus hive. I didn't put grass in or anything. Is that normal or not?
It's awfully cold. Will you come out in this weather?
Well, I do come out because I have to go and look after my bees and make sure they're okay. But yeah.
Did you feed them, Dan?
Yeah, I fed them. So I've got a poly nuke and I filled up. So this was on Saturday. I filled up with syrup on Saturday, and when I went back today, it was all gone. So they are feeding. I've looked inside. There's plenty of bees in there. There's just nothing moving in or out of the hive, and I just that the hive. So the original parent colony is next door, and that's just absolutely booming. It's like Heathrow Airport. But the nuke is just sat there with nothing moving, and I just wondered.
Well, think about it. All the flying bees have gone back to that original colony, haven't they?
Yeah.
So what's left in your nuke is the nurse bees who haven't flown. I would at least turn that nuke round, preferably put it a little away from the parent colony, so that when those nurse bees become flyers, they orientate to the nuke.
Yeah.
But I really honestly wouldn't be worried at this point because they are nurse bees. Nurse bees haven't been outside the colony before. So they will just be feeding, maturing, tending that queen and building up. Remember, they may have wax to pull out as well.
Yeah, so they have started drawing out the frames, I've noticed. So yeah, they are busy in there, just nothing moving at the moment. But thank you, I appreciate that.
Keep feeding them in this weather because it's really very cold. And if they're drawing out wax in this weather, they're doing super well because it's really too cold for it at the moment where I am.
Yeah, okay. I'm down in the southwest. I'm near Bristol, so it's the sun is actually shining today, but you're right, it is a little bit cold.
We've got Elizabeth next.
Hi, yeah. I just wondered, both those methods, do they require the queen cells not to be capped?
Yes, if the queen cells are capped, I would say there's a 90% chance that the swarm has left. Okay.
Okay.
If the queen cells are capped, it's probably a bit late. If the queen cells are capped, I would choose a really nice looking queen cell. Is there a really nice looking uncapped queen cell you could choose?
I've got both. I've got a capped one and an uncapped one that had a big sort of juicy larva in it.
Right. Take down the capped one.
Okay.
Leave the uncapped one. Go back in 5 to 7 days, as I said, and check that they haven't made more queen cells. But mark the frame that your uncapped queen cell is on, so you know where to look for it, either with your queen marking pen or with a drawing pin.
Yep.
you've probably lost your swarm. It's possible in the very cold weather that they're holding back, but
Yeah.
unlikely. I think you've probably lost your swarm, but you don't want to lose any casts. So go back, take off the capped one, keep the uncapped one, and make sure they don't build any more.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there seemed to be a huge amount of bees in there the other day, even though we had the capped one, but that's never a sign that they haven't already swarmed, I believe.
It isn't, because, they're really in full lay at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Deborah next, if you unmute.
Hi, first of all, Jane, thank you so much for the great presentation. I've got a quick question. It's regarding the use of a snail growth board. Would you recommend a snail growth board, like the Pagden method, but vertically?
Are your bees in your garden?
Yes.
If your bees are in your garden and you want to use a snail growth board, it's very effective. It's a bit more complicated. And you have to go out to them every 4 days to open and shut little doors.
Yes.
If you're confident with a Pagden, I would say you could move on to a snail grove. It is quite fun and it does work. But I would make sure that I was fully confident with a Pagden before I did so.
Yeah, I'm an experienced beekeeper. I just wondered whether the snail growth board is actually a better way of doing Pagden, because with Pagden you're moving it physically around where you haven't got space, where with snail grove you're doing the same thing but vertically, aren't you?
Upwards, yeah. And a snail growth board works really well. What it does is it sort of draws the bees down. But yes, it works very well. It just requires more visits. And even with the snail grove, remembering to keep control of those new queen cells is absolutely vital.
Yeah, I've just invested in a snail growth board from the spring convention, so I will be trying that out later.
Both snail grove and Horsley boards work really well, but all they are is a development on the artificial swarm concept.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question for Jane. That's from Arlene. Please, if you unmute.
Thank you, Jane. That was really informative. Thank you very much. So I had 2 colonies through the winter, got through the winter really well. And then I had to go away because my brother passed away. So I had to go away in February. And when I got back, one of them wasn't active. And I was like, oh no, one of them starved, because I did have loads of stores on, but they were doing so well. I think they just gobbled up all of the honey. So then the other one, which was strong, I tried to split, and I tried to do the method you said, but I couldn't find the queen. So I shifted one brood box onto the old site. In fact, what I did was 2 brood box initially, so that the queen that was there could lay into both. Then I put the moved the old box over to one site, shifted the new box onto the old site, and left them for a week. And then I've shifted them the other side, and then when I looked through, the queen was in the other one in the new site. But they're both really, really strong. And I didn't get this weekend. I looked through, I couldn't find her on the new site, but I know she's there because there's eggs and laying and all doing well. But on the old site, I didn't open up because I thought, oh well, I'm going to leave them alone to just get on with it. And there were 2 queen cells in there before. So I was like, I'm thinking, right. Oh no.
So you've got your old box with the queen in that you've moved. It's got the brood and the queen, yeah?
Yeah.
So you've separated the brood and the queen from the flyers.
Yeah.
So I would check that box again to make sure there are no new queen cells, but I think you should be fine on that old box.
Yeah.
On the new box, the new box is on the old site, yeah?
Yeah.
What will happen is the flyers will all come back to there.
Yeah.
And the nurse bees there will draw out queen cells from whatever genetic material they've got in there. So you need to go in as soon as possible and reduce those queen cells to 1.
To 1. Okay. Yeah.
And then you'll be able to leave them for 3 weeks, possibly
Yeah.
4, and another queen will get mated.
Okay, brilliant.
But it's
Thank you.
vital to go and reduce the queen cells now.
Yeah, because when I looked last week, there were 2 queen cells in there, but this weekend I didn't look in, so I'm like, oh God, because if you're talking about the 4 and the 8 and the 16.
Well, you just don't want casts. You don't want 3 or 4 little swarms, do you? Because that it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
So I would just go in as soon as you can and reduce those queen cells. She may have hatched.
Yes.
Don't ever mark a virgin queen though.
No.
If there's a virgin in there, just leave her. You'll know she's little and quick. But don't mark a virgin queen.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. It's so helpful.
Hey, they're very resilient. We learn by trying things out.
Yes. How many years later and I'm still learning every year.
Me too.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Jane. That was absolutely excellent. Before I introduce our next speaker, one of the reasons for us doing a swarm evening this year was the huge amount of social media attention swarms got last year. BBKA had lots and lots of phone call inquiries from newspapers, and I think even the TV asked about it. Could we explain why there were so many swarms? So that's one of the reasons we're having tonight's talk. But now I'd like to introduce Ian Campbell, who manages our social media for us, and he's dealt with lots and lots of inquiries about swarms. Over to you, Ian.
Hi there, good evening, and thank you for inviting me along this evening. Let me see if I can screen share successfully. Are you seeing that?
That's your
Slideshow
presentation. Yeah.
mode. Excellent. Good evening, and as Dan alluded to, last year was a particularly swarmy year, and I think that meant a couple of things. A lot of people were very busy. At the BBKA's base, they often have to get neighbouring associations to support them with the volume of calls that come through. And on social media, a lot of calls come to us, although they're not strictly calls. And this, I think, is one of the changes that we need to be aware of in how we have traditionally dealt with swarming and how we might deal with swarming as associations and as individuals in the future. So just very briefly, let's have a little look about what social media sort of is. And the bottom line of all these graphs is there's a very steep rise. And we've got over 5 billion people, over sort of getting on for 2/3 of the planet, now has a smartphone or a tablet and is attached to one social media or another. So it has an immense reach. What we've done this evening is we've used something very parallel to social media to do this talk. We've used Zoom. This talk will be on YouTube tonight and will be there for the record ever since. This in itself will be a really useful resource that we can point beekeepers to. So we've talked a bit about it already, about how we prepare beekeepers for swarming season and how you might want to use social media to enhance that. So we've got our traditional meetings, we've got our apiary meetings, and those are all very effective. But you and I know that not all members are able to attend face-to-face meetings for whatever reasons. And so what other ways can we reach out to them? How can you help prepare them to be ready for swarming season? So what Jane's illustrated to us tonight is that there are methods of artificial swarming, and understanding those methods is really important. When the moment comes when you suddenly see swarm cells or other sort of cells in your colony, you need to be ready to do something. And sometimes people do panic a little bit. And sometimes it's about a little bit of pre-knowledge, a little bit of preparation can help people to move forwards more easily and more confidently. Share training resources. This hopefully will be a training resource. Other things that you might have done yourselves or other resources that you found really helpful, share those with your members. Swarm prevention and control is sometimes people are not quite clear where one bleeds into another. But that kind of division point for me is always when there's royal jelly and a larvae, obviously in a extended queen cell that's still open, you've moved beyond swarm prevention and you've moved into swarm control. That colony, probably prevention measures are not going to be effective at that point. Reminding members about having extra kit. Every year people are regularly caught out. So just a little reminder, even from early in the year when the sales are on, can be very handy. Having a swarm kit ready. Does your association on its social media maybe put out some monthly tips? Just give people a heads up of what's coming. And sometimes you can see when swarming is moving into your area. Again, give people a heads up that other members are having swarming, just to alert people. Swarms often need a home. Some swarm collectors aren't that interested in keeping swarms themselves and would prefer to pass them on. That can be something that social media can help you with within your associations. Always remind people to keep themselves and the public safe, and when they're doing swarm collection, to do it safely. And do remember, and this is something you can remind members of, your insurance cover via the BBKA has limits. And there are issues where you can't accept payments for collecting swarms, and you can't sell swarms on. So just be aware of those things and remind your members of them. Where can you help get those beekeeper preparation up? Well, BBKA's got a little swarm booklet available from the shop. BBKA News, the May edition should be dropping through your letterboxes by early next week, hopefully. And other things, just simple graphics. People do in their early stages get a bit muddled between a queen cup and a charged queen cell and a sealed cell and a cell that's opened. Give them some pointers. Steer them through a bit. Make it graphic, make it visual, make it obvious to them. There's Jane's resources that we'll have up on YouTube. One of the best resources I've found is if you try and explain the Pagden method of swarm control to a group of people and you try and do it verbally, or you try and do it in a graphic, in a book or something like that, you see people kind of glazing over. Either show them in an apiary demonstration, but even better, a little YouTube video. This one happens to be North Herts Beekeepers Association, bless them for doing it. They've done one on Pagden, Demery and Snellgrove. You can say to a beekeeper who's in this situation, go get your phone out, sit down in your apiary, and before you plow into your swarm control method, sit down and watch it on your phone. It's really helpful, I think, especially for people who are visual learners, to see it visually rather than have to read or read a graphic about it. Personally, I think there's some really good stuff on the Welsh Beekeepers website, which is free downloads from Wally Shaw, who's done some really good little leaflets about Asian hornet, it's on my brain. Swarm control. Share those with your members. If you've got a Facebook page, put those on your Facebook page. They'll end up in the files tab of the Facebook page, and then they're there as a reference for your members from that point on. You're just trying to give people the resources, the tools they need, that when the moment comes, they're as ready as they can be, and they've got the information they need. So the public preparation goes on a little bit. We get, at your association, your swarm collectors will get a lot of contacts. It's important to be clear what we can and can't do. So as much as you're preparing the public, that you're preparing beekeepers, you also need to prepare the public. You will know that a vast number of the calls that come through to a swarm collector, some estimate up as many as 9 out of 10, will be about wasps or bumblebees or solitary bees or another species. If you can put material on your social media, pin it to the top of your Facebook page, repeat it kind of when swarming season's at its height, just to assist the public with identification, but also what you can and can't do. I know people sometimes turn to us as free pest control, but that's not what we're there for. We can deal with honeybee swarms, but there's a lot of stuff we can't do. There are also quite a lot of material on the BBKA's website. Again, you can pin those BBKA web pages onto your social media, or just put them out on your social media at busy times. So when the public go to your sites or your websites or your whatever outlets you've got, they can find information, and hopefully not all of them will then give you a call and take a significant amount of your time with something that may not be honeybee swarms. Maybe have something specific on your website about a swarm page. Clear photographs. That's a real thing. You want people to send you clear photographs when you're trying to identify a swarm. Put some clear sort of photographs on your social media, on your websites, so people can see what you're talking about. What I find disappointing is the number of swarm collectors who in our association, after a year or so, they go, I'm really struggling with the volume of bumblebee calls and things like that, and who step back from being in the front line. And that means other people have to do more, or it leaves areas that aren't covered. So trying to relieve the pressure on those sort of very enthusiastic members who sometimes find it challenging can be helpful. You might have our association's got a short leaflet. We've got it on our social media. We've got it on a website. We send it out to email inquiries, and it explains what we can and can't do quite clearly, what species we will get involved with and what species we won't. And the callback rate when we've sent that out is reduced massively. So we find that helpful. And it is just simple messages. Only honeybee swarms, we don't do wasps, we don't do bumblebees, and we aren't able to do bees in buildings. It is also possibly at some stage worth giving a little bit of a description of if we are coming to pick up a honeybee swarm, the process we'll go through, including popping back in the evening to collect the swarm. So you may or may not be familiar, if you are a swarm collector, with the existing network that works via a map on the BBKA's website, which gives people contact information to a local swarm collector near you. They put in their postcode. The system is fueled by members agreeing to be on the swarm collectors list, and that information goes on to ER2. However, increasingly what we're finding is sometimes people are a little bit nervous about calling somebody. So often, sometimes people will contact associations via social media, whatever social media channels you've got available, or your website or your email address. One common thing is your association monitoring those incoming communications? Because if you're not, you may be missing a lot of swarms. And does sometimes feel like there's a reluctance to call people direct. People do like the sort of slight arm's lengthness of just being able to type something. And more people are using their phones these days to communicate. So it's just one to watch out for. We don't have the protocols for sort of social media as well sorted out as we do for phone contacts. But we all need that basic information, and the basic information comes from, the pictures hopefully illustrate. One came in recently. I have this swarm of bees on my wall, and I have circled the swarm of bees for you to kind of spot. This was in February. I didn't see the swarm of bees. I'm not sure what the identification was. I then had a conversation with them, but that photo was really useful. We need this key information. The flip side is we often get calls about, I've got bees in a bird box. And some of us make the assumption that bird box is probably going to be tree bumblebees who seem to love bird boxes. This bird box was massive. And in fact, when we got the picture, it was obviously honeybees in there. So we are talking about trying to gather as much information in the same way as we do with swarm calls, but using social media. There are other things that we can use if we're using things like what 3 words. You can get a much more accurate location for a swarm than a postcode. A postcode can be half a street. and a swarm tucked behind a bush in somebody's sort of, even if it's in their front accessible garden, what 3 words will give us a better chance of finding it? So things like that, I think, are helpful via social media. Yeah, and just the other basic information of get contact numbers. If the swarm leaves, ask them to give you a call back, and matters like that. WhatsApp groups. Depending on the size of your association and how involved you are with social media, little WhatsApp groups may be a swarm group for people who are active swarm collectors, but also you might have people who are interested in getting swarms but aren't prepared to be on the swarm collectors list, but are available at times when others aren't. Having that, if your association has some kind of capacity for swarm coordination, that little WhatsApp group can mean a swarm gets collected as opposed to one that doesn't, because everyone's really busy at that time of year. It works. The WhatsApp groups can work quickly. It's easy to email an individual separately the details of where something is or what's going on. And they can also be useful to find homes for swarms that a collector might not want. Now, just moving on, just slightly beyond swarms for 2 seconds, if you have got your social media geared up, you could also use it for other stuff. And Asian hornets is a prime thing that you might want to consider using your sort of your social media groups for. And finally, these are just some of the apps and things that you might want to consider using. We're all here on Zoom tonight. If you've not come across Canva, Canva can be a really useful thing to make simple but effective graphics on. Eventbrite can be a really useful thing for kind of organizing sort of meetings and events. What 3 words, as I've just described, can be really useful for locating swarms and giving people exact locations. Most of you will know about Asian Hornet Watch. As we discussed earlier, you can't accept payment for collecting swarms or sell swarms, but you could suggest that people might want to give your association a donation. A PayPal donate button might help that. The other thing on this page at the top there is the BBKA started a very small at the moment social media network, which is a small WhatsApp group accessed via that link, which is just a group of people who are using social media in beekeeping, who are just trying to work together to share some information and some knowledge to make everyone's life a little bit easier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I'm sure everyone's found that really useful for some ideas on how associations and beekeepers can help deal with swarms. Our next guest is Tim, who's called the Apiarist Atelier, and his talk's all about the consequences of what happens if we don't catch our swarms. Are you ready, Tim, to share your screen?
Yep, sorry, just unmuting. Hopefully, yes. Second.
There we go. Lovely. Thanks, Tim.
Perfect. Good evening. If the colony has swarmed and left the apiary or left whichever tree or another building and effectively moves towards a building, we're into a completely different kettle of fish. As a quick preamble, I come from a background where I have 35 plus years of architectural experience, years of beekeeping knowledge, and 10 plus years removing bees from buildings, but specializing at the listed building end of things. Originally started off with simple cutouts and trap outs, and then slowly over the years built up to slightly more complicated removals. Locally, where I live in Cambridgeshire, we have a good number of thatch cottages, old listed buildings right up to grade 1 buildings in Cambridge itself, for example, Jesus College and other nearby colleges. So it's been a fun playground for me, but it's also provided a huge number of challenges. Effectively, we have a swarm that'll have it will be at rest somewhere locally while the scout bees are out looking for their new home. A long time ago, they used to have the choice of hundreds of hollow trees, but as people have moved across to central heating and older buildings have got older, the bees effectively saw buildings as an alternative to the natural habitat, and as it's already been explained this evening, beekeepers have the normal beekeeping insurance, but as soon as bees are in buildings, specialist insurance is required, but also a different skill set. In other words, understanding a colony within the constraints of a building, the building constraints, and all of those issues combined. And I've come across instances where beekeepers have tried to be helpful, and for example, an old building where bees have been seen to swarm, and the building occupants have phoned up a beekeeper and said, a bee swarm has just swarmed down our chimney. And the beekeeper suggested that the lady light a fire under the bees to smoke the bees out of the chimney before they became established. However, you cannot take the opinion of the owner because the owner never has all of the facts. This particular one, the owner didn't see the swarm arrive. It had actually arrived the year before, and what she had actually experienced wasn't the colony swarming in, but an established colony swarming out. And if she had lit a fire under the colony, there was potential for carbon monoxide poisoning within the house, but even more extreme, that the beeswax could have melted, a chimney fire could have ensued, and this particular building was a 14th century thatch cottage. And if you have a chimney fire in a thatched cottage, it's very, very likely that the whole building will burn down. And from speaking to the homeowner, well, homeowners plural, the majority of colonies in buildings, they're not actually new swarms, but they're more likely to be an established colony that the building owner has effectively just noticed, because you're not normally looking up at your chimney pots or a roof or a soffit or a verge. And so therefore, there's entities like the UKBR that, rather than suggest solutions that you may not be in full grasp of the whole scenario, that it's better to effectively suggest that the better route is to get in touch, for example, a not-for-profit organisation, the UKBR, which is a portal for the public to make contact with professional bee removers, and in that way they don't put the building owner or the general public at risk. That these entities have adequate insurance, the skill set to extract the colonies, and in a safe manner, and not putting either the building, the owners, or the public at risk. This is a view looking up a 14th century chimney in Norfolk. That is absolutely amazing what the bees get up to when left to their own devices within buildings. But we have scout bees that literally survey every inch of the outside of a building, find a suitable cavity, move in, and slowly build up to a full-size colony. Some of these are left for 8 to 10 years. Other colonies that I've been made aware of have been not the same colony, but effectively honeybees in residence over an extended period of time. One old directory up in Wood Walton, we actually uncovered evidence of a little old rusty tin in the chimney with a crumpled up piece of burnt newspaper, and the newspaper was actually dated 1947. But the bees, there were actually 9 colonies in the whole building that had been, one colony had been left. It then multiplied and multiplied until the son of the owner, once he inherited the building, he had the task of removing all of those colonies to return the building back to a non-bee infested residence. We have lots of potential locations for bees in buildings. Each have their own risks and their own nuances. You end up with potential of bees in chimneys, bees in roof voids, timber frame buildings within the wall cavities, and even new build, which, according to the building regs, the contractors are meant to protect all ingress points from insects. But if you understand that a bee can use an entrance which is small in comparison to what a builder is working to, it means that they have access to large areas of a property, and many of these areas aren't even observed by the owner or the residents. It falls to a bee extraction entity to undertake a pre-extraction survey to understand where the bee colony is, the size, the strength, and the building constraints, i.e., where exactly the colony has established itself, and then we use a various selection of new technology and old technology to actually understand the colony. This is a part of Hatfield House. It's a timber frame with render infill panels, and the bee colony is actually within the historic cavity of the building. The white area is the brood area of the colony at roughly 35 degrees, and then the cooler orange is the more normal temperature of the empty cavity, with the entrance through a slightly decayed timber beam towards the top of the building. If swarm control is kept under control and buildings are well maintained, we wouldn't have a problem. But bees in buildings becomes difficult, expensive, and problematical. a very recent removal, a church in Essex, 13th century Grade 1 listed. The beekeeper actually lives in the farm, literally a couple of 100 meters away. His bees swarmed, and unfortunately, they swarmed into a void below a rather well put together lead pitched roof. When it comes to buildings like this, it then it gets very, very expensive. Listed buildings of this nature, you cannot just rip them open, remove the bees, and then make good. It all needs to be considered and undertaken with the utmost care. Other buildings, people look on bees and chimneys. It's very simple. You just open up the chimney, remove the bees. This was a limestone chimney in Lincolnshire. The limestone slabs are all sat on the edge, and effectively the pink coloured slabs had actually moved over time. And if any of the slabs were taken out of the chimney in the wrong order, the whole pack of cards would have collapsed. If that's undertaken by an individual that doesn't know what they're doing, there's a potential that the insurance of the house owner is null and void. There's a potential of health and safety risks of collapse, partial or full collapse of the chimney, and it's just not worth the risk. Long-established colonies, a misconception: bees don't populate roof voids. This is a Grade 2 listed building in Gloucestershire. The bees were there for about 12 years, and they actually populated a length of roof slope from the gutter right up to ridge. And the homeowner got in touch because the postman refused to deliver parcels. Amazon wouldn't deliver. Courier services wouldn't touch the house with a barge pole, and the neighbouring neighbours, they couldn't actually spend time in their gardens because that colony requeened itself, and it became a very aggressive colony. And it was due to the owner of the building had the attitude, oh, we'll live and let be. But once things became problematical, in other words, people having to duck and dive to the front door, then they considered that the bees had to go. And it was a 3-day process of carefully opening up a traditional limestone roof, remove the bees, bee-proof the roof, and then put it all back together again. Other locations, for example, bees and chimneys, more normal, opening up brickwork and removing colonies still has its potential due to buildings having been adapted, repointing not having been carried out properly, and unknown defects. So again, full surveys need to be undertaken before even considering removing bees if the buildings are not in good repair. And therefore, you'll find on the BBKA website that there's a bees and buildings page with links to the UKBR and UKBR members who do have bee extraction knowledge, but you need to make the general public aware that whoever undertakes a bee extraction from a building needs to be have the skill set, the insurance cover, and the experience to actually come at the problem and look at all of the subtleties. For example, it isn't necessarily a new swarm, but it can be and the majority of the time, it is a well-established colony. And it becomes a problem not just for the building owner, but the surrounding owners. And if those swarms establish themselves, that established colony then throws out swarms, and those swarms then establish other colonies in buildings or the surrounding area. And the problem just escalates. That I know of a number of villages where the general public are now actually applying pressure to those who have bees in buildings, but have the attitude of, oh, they're not causing us any problem. But each year, they're actually watching those colonies throw out swarms and populate other chimneys, and then those neighbours then have additional problems to resolve. So it becomes a very, very messy problem. And to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, last year the UKBR received 1,863 inquiries regarding bees in buildings, and that's potentially just the tip of the iceberg. So it's vitally important, as the first speaker was explaining, that swarm control is vitally important because it's not just losing a colony of bees, or sorry, a swarm of bees, but someone else may be inheriting those bees in somewhere where the bees shouldn't really be. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Tim. That's really interesting to see some of the buildings you've extracted swarms from. So there's at least one question for you. I think he was called Peter, who wants to ask a question. If you can unmute Peter and ask the question.
Yeah, hi Tim. It's Pete here from Be Gone.
Good evening.
As well. Me and Tim know each other through sort of doing this very specialised work. Tim, I do have a question, one that the members might find useful as well. Have you ever come across like American foul brood in any of the colonies that you've removed, or
not to date?
Yeah. Okay.
There have been a number of not me personally, but a number of cases of European foul brood. But to date, we haven't found any American foul brood.
Great, brilliant. That's really, really good presentation. So thank you for that.
No, pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Peter. It's probably a really good reminder, isn't it, that if we lose a swarm and it happens to have EFB and it gets out into the wild and there's enough food, it'll survive long enough to produce more bees, more swarms next year. And they can be reservoirs of disease. So it is really important to control our swarms. And that'll really help people not have bees in their buildings. Elizabeth has a question. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. It was really sort of following on from my earlier question that I had a capped queen cell and therefore mine might have already swarmed. Is there anything we should do if we think we've lost a swarm? Is there anywhere we should report it, or just unfortunately accept the fact that it might have already gone?
I think if you can't see it hanging somewhere you can collect, then you have to assume it's gone.
Yeah.
Having stood and watched a swarm go to the top of the tallest tree at the bottom of our allotment apiary, but over the fence, I knew there was absolutely nothing we could do. We couldn't get a cherry picker on site within sort of 20 minutes, which we'd have needed to do. Sadly, you do have to wave goodbye to them. And it's one of the things to think about. I know not everyone likes clipping the wings of queens, but that actually stops the queen disappearing into a chimney, perhaps.
Right.
Possibly watch for cast swarms following up from that. If you've lost a prime, you might get some more smaller swarms if there's more than one queen cell left.
Okay, yeah, we'll do. I mean, it's in the garden, so last year I saw them, but obviously I haven't seen anything this year to date. So, but yeah, I'll keep an eye out for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan's got his hand up. Hello, Alan.
Yeah, it was just a question for the apiarist that was just doing the presentation. What actually happens to the swarms of bees that you collect, and are they you know, more varroa resistant, maybe, etc.?
Well, it depends. For example, I had a number of removals in Oxfordshire last year. The bees, I'm fully aware of the issues locally here, that Cambridgeshire is a hotspot for European foul brood. And therefore, for example, if I'm removing colonies from buildings over in Oxfordshire, those bees are actually relocated to local beekeepers in Oxfordshire, rather than the potential risk of moving them around the country. That it's part of the methodology of the bee extraction, that we cannot become a vector from, for example, moving a colony from a non European foul brood area to from a European foul brood area to a non-European foul brood area, in the same way that, for example, the extractions that have carried out in Cambridgeshire, which is a hotspot, that those bees don't actually leave Cambridge City itself, but were actually relocated to beekeepers within Cambridge City itself. And the same protocol is carried out elsewhere. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does, thanks. Yeah, I was just curious because some of the colonies you showed us there in the presentation were vast, weren't they? They were massive.
Yeah. Well, the colony in Stroud, strangely, it was very, very aggressive during the survey, and the reason that the homeowner got in touch was because of the aggression. But by the time it's also, it depends on how the colony is actually opened up. That because I'm working predominantly on the older listed buildings, I don't like using power tools. And it's always for example, the scaffolders using battery-powered tools to put the scaffolding together that upsets the bees. But in taking the buildings apart manually, the Stroud colony, for example, was actually very, very placid during the extraction, and it wasn't a problem.
No, it's brilliant. No, thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks. We'll have Chadwick next.
Oh, thank you, Tim. Great talk. Interesting. Thank you. We've got a friend that has a campsite in Pembrokeshire, and he's got a wild colony in his roof space of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And he seems to enjoy sharing it, basically. So he's not wanting to do anything about removal. But that colony must be huge. It's been there at least 10 years. And
Mm-hmm.
it appears to be using a different entranceway into the roof space now. Is there something that should be done? Should we have some sort of duty of care to report it, or just anything like that?
Well, at the end of the day, it's up to the building owner as to if something is done, if something's not done. As I mentioned, I am aware of colonies in buildings where you have a rather stubborn owner that says, well, the bees aren't doing any harm to me, but they've actually videoed the colony throwing out swarms, the swarm crossing the road and going straight into a chimney across the way. And then, because a lot of the chimneys aren't active anymore, it's not just a case that the bees can be recovered from an active chimney, but when it's a capped chimney or a chimney with air bricks, that there's no quick and easy solution to getting the bees back out again. That it's the surrounding owners of rather than saying a wild colony, the feral colony, each time it throws out a swarm, you don't know where that'll end up, and it can potentially cause problems. For example, the rectory I was working on, it's had bees in the building since just after the war. And the evidence was actually blocked up in some of the chimneys that still have obviously not the same colonies, but once you have, you've had a bee colony in a building, the residue, the smells, the pheromones, and everything else, the bees will track those down. And when you've got a wild colony in a building that's left for years and years, okay. I've seen colonies grow and then become smaller through they've shrunk from possibly 4 or 5 cavity voids back down to 1 or 2, and then build themselves back up again. That they seem to thrive in some of the building cavities in some of the locations, especially if it's a protected cavity, be it a chimney, a roof void, or whatever. And it's amazing both the size and just the pure quantity of stores that they bring in. If you imagine that, because they're bringing in nectar, and the nectar's the majority of the nectar is water. They have to drive off all of that water. And for example, the church in Essex that I was working on, part of the roof, the moisture content has been elevated because the colony sat at its 35 degrees. It's thrown off huge, literally gallons and gallons of water out of the colony. And once you get that amount of moisture into an older building, that older building doesn't have preserved timbers. There's no treatment on those timbers, so therefore you have woodworm sets in, rot sets in, and decay, and the building fabric literally falls apart, and so therefore bees in some locations could potentially be left, but they normally become a problem for the surrounding neighbours. But if you have them in roof voids or parts of the building that have materials that can rot and decay if the damp levels are too high, then you have big problems. Especially if it's a timber frame building, that you've got an oak frame that's been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. However, once you've got a bee colony involved, especially if, for example, in the 60s or 70s, they've replaced the original lime render with cement, you've got a bee colony that's effectively sweating behind the cement, and it's rotting the timber frame away. So it can be a huge problem depending on where the colony is.
Thank you. I've got a question from someone in the chat that perhaps we'd all be interested to think about. If your neighbour thinks your bees have swarmed into their house, are you liable as the beekeeper whose bees they used to be for any removal costs?
Are you going to answer this one, Diane?
No, I'm probably not actually.
There is a book called Bees at Law, written by Richard Knoll, I believe. I may be wrong there, but it's called Bees at Law, that does go over case law of beekeeping and sort of such matters. So that may be something to kind of have a look at.
Yeah, I think we'll have to look into that if Tim's got an answer.
Well, there are. I'm aware of a number of cases at the moment that I'm dealing with as effectively as an expert witness. Not of the IDing of the bees. That's been made quite straightforward because the neighbouring building owners managed to video on a number of occasions the swarm leaving the house in question, crossing the street, sitting on the outside of the chimney for half an hour, and then marching into the new chimney. So effectively, there is case law, of whether that historically it's always been difficult to prove whose bees they actually are, but with modern tech, if you actually manage to video said colony throwing out a swarm and then moving into your chimney, you have the evidence to prove. But it's more difficult that you wouldn't have the video of the swarms leaving someone's apiary, traveling the next door houses, and then effectively moving in. So it is still a very grey area.
Thanks, Tim. I think the thing to say is if we can all do our best to avoid losing swarms.
Correct.
That's probably the best thing. Did you want to add something else, Ian?
Sorry, that book is Noel Sweeney, my mistake, Noel Sweeney, Bees at Law, and it does cover quite a lot of case law regarding beekeeping and civil disputes.
Right, thanks. Jeff has got a question. Do you want to unmute, Jeff?
Yeah, just a very quick question. You made a really good point about people may have noticed for the first time that they've got bees in the chimney, but they may have been there for quite some time. And I thought it was a very good point that, lighting a fire underneath it might be exactly the wrong thing to do.
Well, it's potentially the worst thing that can be done.
Exactly, and I thought that was a really good point. I've been called to people's houses, that have noticed bees in their chimney. The question I had for you is, obviously they won't know whether they've just moved in or not.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered, in your experience, rather than light a fire, have you ever used, the sort of smoke bombs that sort of chimney sweeps use? Obviously,
but the smoke bombs, smoke bombs that chimney sweeps use, those are intended for testing the integrity of a flue. They're not intended for use on bee swarms. Rather than guessing, that's the whole point of actually undertaking the bee survey. That it's a combination of accessing the colony at the top, be it a chimney or elsewhere, and using infrared drone cameras, endoscopes, and miniature CCTV, and effectively getting eyes to check what is actually up at the top of the chimney. Normally, if you get a phone call, the member of the public isn't they don't have a background in beekeeping, so all they know is they have what to them sounds like a swarm up the chimney, and there's a number of reasons why those bees will not remain at the top of the chimney and will effectively show themselves internally. They can accidentally swarm down the chimney rather than up the chimney. Lights on in the if it's for example, a living room fireplace after dark can entice some of the bees that will come down and try and figure out what the light source is. Or for example, last year in the height of the summer, there was a good number of partial colony collapses. Not that the colony was dying, but effectively the structure of the wax let go when it was fully laden with stores, and so therefore you would have a comb or two of the bee colony collapsing down the chimney. Those bees then climbing out of the chimney through small crevices and gaps in the registry plate, and then the homeowner not being aware that there's any debris or wax above the registry plate of the fireplace, thinking that it's a swarm, but it is a collapsed colony. And then if they light the fire, it's not that there's that the colony's necessarily at the top of the chimney. If part of the colony has collapsed in the first place, you're actually lighting a fire with possibly the wax between the stainless steel liner and the brickwork or stonework of the chimney, and then the wax will melt, and with a flash point of just over 200 degrees, then you have perfect conditions for a rather intense chimney fire with a decent amount of accelerant.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I brought up the smoke bomb thing is that you've got the same result of smoke to try and drive them out without the heat to cause the fire. That was my only idea.
Yeah, well, I would only suggest there's if you can actually a beekeeper wouldn't be able to get up to the top of a chimney to check whether or not it's an established colony or not, and hence that it's still very risky to smoke that swarm out of the chimney. But for example, if it was one of those rare occasions where, for example, the owner has seen the swarm leave a chimney across the road, move in and swarm into a chimney, but again, would you not rather be safe, or sorry, would you rather not check and then rather than risk applying a smoke bomb or whatever to a colony up the chimney?
Yeah, no, it was just a thought that occurred to me. That's all. When you said about the fire risk, I thought perhaps a smoke bomb might work, but yeah, I think there's a bit more caution.
Well, I personally, I'm not sure of the exact contents of the smoke bombs that it's
what chemically you mean?
Yeah, Peter's got something to say. Do you want to jump in on that, Peter?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say, I actually, as you know, I actually run a pest control business as well. So, which I've been doing for 17 years, which is how we started up with Be Gone. And one of the reasons I know Tim there, that smoke bombs, also, you can buy smoke bombs online, unfortunately. And we do use them in pest control to kill wasps in certain situations as well, where they come into rooms and the room's just full of wasps. And some of the smoke bombs actually carry insecticide, so they're like insecticide smoke bombs. So when we use the term smoke bombs, often the public understands smoke bombs as a killing smoke bomb rather than something a flue specialist would use, as Tim's mentioned, to test the integrity of a flue. So I think when we use smoke bombs, we need to be really careful speaking to the public about that, because they'll just go onto Amazon and order insecticide smoke bombs, and the smoke is the carrying agent of the chemical, which would then contaminate the combs and obviously the bees at large as well. So sorry, Tim, I didn't mean to jump in there.
No, that's quite okay.
No, when I broached the subject, I was thinking of what my chimney sweep brings along, which is, to me, I thought was just purely a smoke generator.
And I think the point about, we put out bait hives, and quite often we'll put a horrible old bit of comb in there, even though the bee inspector really frowns at us and tells us we should burn it. but it makes a really good bait box. And if you think about a chimney that's maybe had a swarm in the previous year and the colonies died because of whatever reason, you know, Tom Seeley says lots of them don't survive, that then acts as a bait box for the next swarm to come in. So it might be, even if you've watched bees go in, they've got comb in there. And I think that's a really important thing to say. We as normal beekeepers shouldn't be climbing on roofs, peering in chimneys, because our insurance really doesn't cover us for that. So I think that's probably a fairly sensible thing to say. Don't climb on the roof to see if there's a swarm in the chimney.
I wouldn't go up on the roof even if I was insured. So
no, me neither. So we are nearly at 9 o'clock. Thank you everyone who's sat and listened tonight. Thank you very much to our speakers, Jane, Ian and Tim. It's been a really lovely evening. The evening is recorded on YouTube for you all to watch again if you want to go over Jane's presentation at the weekend when you're looking in your bees and you found queen cells. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Great
you.
talks. Well done.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Brilliant.
Good evening. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Good night, Jeff.
Just what I was thinking.
You can